So away we go. And again, I'm not an expert. Jim Vada is the expert, okay? But I have been working for Seven Signal for going on 10 years now, and rubbing shoulders with guys like Jim is just so beneficial, amazing. I was a person who came into this business, all of those years ago, really not understanding, knowing how this works. And this actually turned into my position at Seven Signal as the head of customer success. It's my responsibility to take kind of complicated things and hopefully break them down so that folks can understand them, use our systems and such like that. So here we go. Okay, the first concept that's really important to understand when it comes to Wi-Fi is that Wi-Fi is just radio. Okay, a lot of people, they don't think it's the same thing as like tuning into 100.7 classic rock FM on your FM tuner, but it is. It's the same thing. Okay, those are just frequencies that we can hear. Okay, but there are all sorts of frequencies that we can't hear. They're way out of our spectrum of hearing, right? So we can hear from like 20, kilohertz up to 20,000 kilohertz or something like that. But these are happening at frequencies that are just way, 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 way out of the spectrum and we can't hear. But you've got a tuner, and that tuner, which you can see on the screen here, is tuning into a frequency. And there is some tower out there on a hill that is broadcasting, that is transmitting on that frequency. And so therefore, when I tune in, I get the content. Now, here's the thing. Not everybody can just transmit and receive on 100.7 classic rock FM or KISS 102 or whatever. That's licensed. Those organizations pay money to the FCC, the government, to reserve the right to broadcast on that frequency in a certain market. Okay. But here's the thing. Wi-Fi is free, unlicensed spectrum. Anybody is allowed to use it. The government said, hey, you know what? We're going to charge money for you to broadcast and for you to broadcast, but we're going to set aside some frequencies that anybody can use as long as they play by a kind of a small set of rules. Anybody can use it. And guys, this is where Wi-Fi lives. So what are we talking about here in terms of devices? Everything that you can think of out there that's wireless is using these free unlicensed spectrums, bands. Okay, so baby monitors, drones, automatic door openers, we've got security cameras, we've got wireless mice, keyboards, speakers, headphones, everything that you can think of. And it's using this unlicensed or free spectrum, which is available to anybody that they can use. Now, because it's available to everybody, we run into problems, right? We run into problems when we are in our house and trying to use our Wi-Fi. And those problems we're going to talk about today. But just take what I talked about with the tower on the hill. Well, it's not a tower on a hill, but it's a little router, mini access point in your house. And that's your little mini tower on a hill in your house. And it's broadcasting on these different frequencies or these bands of frequency. So the 2.4 gigahertz band of frequency and the 5 gigahertz frequency band of frequency. And this is a band. And when we say band, we mean that 2.4 represents a swath of frequencies. And then we divide that swath of frequencies up into little bits. And those little bits we call channels that we can then connect on, transmit and receive on. Okay. A lot of routers in your house are going to be dual band, meaning couple things. It could be that they have one radio that has the ability to flip-flop back and forth between 2, 4, and 5, depending upon the need, or it could have two radios where one is dedicated to 5 gigahertz and the other is dedicated to 2.4. All right, so again, basic issues to understand. If you don't understand some of these concepts that we're going to talk about today, then it's hard to understand Wi-Fi. Okay, so we're going to unpack this a little bit today for you. So here we go. First, we're going to talk about coverage. All right, we're not going to talk about physics. We're not going to talk about the inverse square law and all of that. But what you need to know is that these radio waves, they don't last forever, right? When you're in your car and you're driving out of the city, what happens? The radio station turns into static. Okay, those radio waves, they spread out, they dissipate, and then they're gone. Okay, and that is the inverse square law pretty much. But here's the thing, guys. You need to know how far these things can go in Wi-Fi. They can't travel forever. And so what we do is we take a look at the frequencies, and those frequencies have properties. And those properties are going to determine how far they can travel through space before they spread out, dissipate, and are gone. Now, what you need to know, without getting into too much of the math, is that lower frequencies have a longer wavelength. And the wavelength is what you can see here. It's basically one cycle from beginning of the cycle to the end of the cycle. Okay, and that one cycle is long at lower frequencies. And what that also means is that the signal can propagate through space farther and can go much farther than higher frequencies. Okay, so this is why you can get television, miles away from the towers, because they're using these frequencies here, which allow the signal with a certain amount of power behind it to propagate far through space. And not only that, but these big, long wavelengths, they have the ability to travel through objects more easily than these little tiny waves, which are generated by the higher frequencies. They peter out more quickly. They can't penetrate through objects so easily and so quickly. And they also can't go as far because, once again, it's a smaller wavelength. And because those particles are going to spread out and dissipate, they just can't go as far. Okay, so you got to know that. Now, when it comes to the world of Wi-Fi, 2.4 is the lower frequency. And what we generally say is that 2.4 can travel approximately twice as far as 5 gigahertz, approximately, so long as we don't have barriers to propagation. Now, here's the thing with regards to 2.4, right? So you could be like, how like when you're in your parking lot and it's like, oh my gosh, I can get Wi-Fi all the way higher in the parking lot, right? Well, that's probably 2.4, right? That's probably 2.4. Now, there's advantages and disadvantages to that we're going to talk about in a minute. But at the simplest level, you just simply, a lot of people are not aware of the fact that 2.4 will travel approximately twice as far as 5 gigahertz, and that you have to know that because it's just the properties of the frequency, of the fact that it's a lower frequency, and the math makes it so that it can travel much farther. And this is interesting here. You see, we were talking about the dual band router access point here in your house or wherever it is. It's funny, Jim, because the word dual band has been around forever. Dual band typically means you've got one radio that can go 2.4 or 5, or maybe you've got two radios that can do 2.4 and the other one can do 5. Then you started seeing on the market tri-band, and tri-band, that label, that moniker has been out on the market forever, for many, many years. And it typically meant I've got one radio dedicated to 5 gigahertz, and then another radio that can go 2.4 and 5, or maybe it's got 3 radios in it where one of them is dedicated to 2.4 and then the other 2 are dedicated to 5. I mean, those are the ones that get a little bit more expensive, Jim, don't they?
They do. And it's a good thing that in the enterprise world, we don't use those weird tri-band, quad band, whatever terms, because it doesn't really tell you what's going on. So
it's marketing mambo jumbo.
Yeah.
Sorry, Heather. What's interesting,
she's used to it.
Yeah, she's used to it. But what's interesting is that when they came out with the new 6 gigahertz band, right, Wi-Fi 6E, they're like, now what are we going to do? And so that's when you started seeing the term quad band come into the market. And I just found that to be very, very interesting.
Yeah, and there's potential. I'm hearing with Wi-Fi 7 products, you might have these just absurd consumer APs with, one 2.4 gigahertz radio, 2 5 gigahertz radios, and 2 6 gigahertz radios. So that would be what, hexaband? I mean, I don't know what you would call it at that point.
Hex band.
Besides expensive and wasteful.
Expensive and wasteful. I totally would agree. Once again, and especially when it comes to, the consumers understanding Wi-Fi, when we broadcast an SSID in our home, a network name, and let's just say it's the family network. Okay. you don't, and the family network supports both 2.4 and 5. A lot of people don't realize that they're connected to one or the other based upon where they're located in the house, or even out on the deck or out in front or something like that. You don't know that you're connected to the 2.4 or the 5, and that could have some implications. So we think that, we're wow, this is great, I get Wi-Fi all the way out here, but sometimes that's not necessarily good. Now let's talk about barriers to propagation. Okay, again, these radio waves, they can't just travel forever, and they also can't penetrate through any and all surfaces. And the two surfaces that we're most concerned about in Wi-Fi are concrete and metal. Concrete and metal. So you can see here, this woman behind her desk, okay, so this is propagating through the wood paneling just fine, no problem. Wood, glass, nothing plaster, nothing to really worry about there. But radio waves are going to get absorbed into the concrete here. So that's why this person's really, taking a nap instead of working, because they can't get Wi-Fi. Now, this person in the middle of your screen here, why is she so happy? Okay, why is she so happy when it doesn't look like she has Wi-Fi? Well, it's because with metal, the radio waves are going to bounce off of the lockers here, and then she has the ability to now get the signal. And in Wi-Fi, we call this multipath, where sometimes we depend upon the signal bouncing around all over the place in order to get the performance that we're looking for. Jim, any words about when multipath kind of came onto the scene and turned into a real benefit in order to achieve certain levels of performance?
Yeah. Multipath has been with us since the beginning of Wi-Fi. And since Wi-Fi is primarily used indoors, there's a lot of things for the signal to bounce off of. And so in the early days of Wi-Fi, multipath caused a lot of problems. The receivers would get multiple signals with slightly different timing differences, and that would just cause a destructive form of interference. But now, since 802.11n, also known as Wi-Fi 4, we can take advantage of multipath. So those separate signals that are bouncing around and arriving at different times. This is an amazing thing. I wouldn't believe it if I didn't see it with my own eyes. But it actually allows us to send different bits, different data streams through those paths on the same channel at the same time. It's almost magical.
It is. It's funny. I just remember we were like, oh, remember when multipath was a bad thing? Now it's a good thing.
Yeah.
It's just unbelievable with the technology. So yeah, that came about kind of like, that's what I was thinking in that 802.11n era, right? About, 15 to 20 years ago. So, all right. Awesome. Even crowds of people can be a barrier to propagation. We do a lot of work in highly dense environments. There are crowds of people, and those signals, it's like, you think about us, we're like these, we joke, we're like these big jelly sacks of water, right? And radio waves don't pass through water so nicely all the time. This is why we also have problems with outdoor Wi-Fi when it's raining, when there's really hard rain. Jim, I know a lot of people, they wonder about how much rain and weather can impact Wi-Fi outdoors. And the answer is, it could affect it a lot. And so therefore it's not necessarily reliable. What do you say?
Yeah, absolutely. Rain, water, plants, which have a lot of water in them, all those things affect signal propagation outdoors.
All right, so that's why we need tools. Okay, and so just a few weeks ago, we had a big session about how we were talking about the site survey and walking around in order to figure out, okay, and we don't call it site survey anymore, do we, Jim? I can't remember.
Well, I think it's okay to say site survey if you add a few qualifiers to it, like on-site signal site survey or something.
On-site signal
measurement or
determiner. Yeah. The point is that when we have a map and we need to put in like what the different surfaces are on the floor plan, right? Like this is a concrete, this is sheet walk, this is this kind of wall, this is metal. And by doing that, and then it's going to then, as we walk around, it's going to actually then tell us how the signal is or isn't propagating, basically giving us a map for where we need to place these things around our office in order to create the coverage that we need, right? And, Ekahau is it's kind of like the industry standard in this thing, but there are lots of other systems and tools out there too, right, Jim?
Yep, absolutely. There's a NetAli, there's Homina, IB Wave.
Yep, that's right.
Yep.
And what's important to note is that when we make this design decision, I mean, it's kind of something that we do every few years. It's not something that we do on a weekly basis or even a monthly basis. Okay, what we hope is that the environment does not change all that often, such that we can put this system in place. We can strategically place these things in different areas, and that should do us good for the next, few years until we have a refresh. Okay. So that's all about signal propagation. It's just really important to know and understand that these things, they just can't sneak around the corner. There is something called beamforming out there where we can try to direct a signal into a certain direction with our antennas, and that's important to note as well. There are directional antennas, which will point a beam of energy down, for instance, an aisle, which is really important. Okay, otherwise, if we just go with your basic omnidirectional antenna, which is kind of what we're seeing on the screen right here, just kind of a pattern of propagation that is like circular, kind of goes in all directions, relatively speaking, of course. That may be exactly what we need, and in other situations, it may be exactly the problem. Jim, you have a lot of experience with directional antennas and beam forming. Anything to say about how important it is to understand that those concepts or that those products are there, they're available, and that depending upon your use case, they really need to be looked at closely?
Yeah, for sure. A lot of times indoors, we default to the integrated antennas, an AP that has everything built in. Those are omnidirectional and the signals kind of spread out evenly from the AP. But in many use cases, especially outdoors, especially in high density environments, having a directional antenna with a focused signal is desirable for relieving congestion in those high density areas, and then outdoors for getting greater range as well.
That's right. That's right. Now, Jim, another thing that we were talking about recently was with regards to, I think maybe it was you, maybe it was Marco, another one of our experts here. We were talking about how because 2.4 propagates further, we need to make sure that we boost the power of our 5 gigahertz so that, clients will actually hear 5 gigahertz before they hear 2.4. Otherwise, everybody would just latch on to 2.4. Can you tell me a little bit about the importance of that configuration based upon what we've learned so far today with propagation?
Really important thing to consider, even at home, but definitely in the enterprise, is to, in order to get better 5 gigahertz coverage and get more clients connecting to 5 gigahertz, because those Wi-Fi clients decide what radio they're going to connect to.
Right.
We need to have that signal level from 5 gigahertz actually higher than 2.4 gigahertz. So we need to do something to sort of overcome the natural differences between those two bands, where 2.4 gigahertz has greater range and is all things even would be about 6 decibels louder than 5. So you want to plan your design so not necessarily increasing the power of 5 gigahertz, but decreasing the power of 2.4, at least 6, and often, 9 dB or more below where your 5 gigahertz transmit power is. Seems like a lot, but remember, there's always that 6 dB you have to account for. That's just going to be a part of the system as it's, out in the RF. So if you do that, you get, better 5 gigahertz coverage, and you'll have clients more naturally inclined to connect to 5 gigahertz where there's more capacity, which I think Eric's going to get into here in a moment.
Yeah, exactly. That's really good. I just made a note of that. The 6 or 9 dB lower, and you can dial that down on your controller. You don't necessarily have those dials on a home router per se. They don't, sometimes you do, sometimes you don't, but and also it's important to note, guys, is that devices, there's no such thing as turning up or turning down the power. So it's really, it really needs to be thought through. Okay, awesome. Let's go to our next topic here. We're going to talk about congestion. Okay, as you can see, and congestion in Wi-Fi is very similar to congestion on the highway, which is why we've got this nice little visual for you here. You've got not enough lanes, too many cars. What happens? Everything just starts to bog down and slow down. Okay, and I think that before we understand congestion, we need to understand the protocol. The protocol 802.11 has this built into it, this clear channel assessment built into it. Okay, think of Wi-Fi as like a walkie-talkie. You push the button and then you start talking. And while you're doing that, you can't hear and nobody else can talk. And then you let go and then somebody else can talk because the channel is clear. Wi-Fi works similarly, if not identically. Okay, and so what happens is that part of the protocol is going to check and see if the channel is clear. And the first part of that is called signal detect. It's looking for any kind of 802.11 energy. Any kind of 802.11 energy, and that's got to be 4 dB above the noise floor. And the noise floor is like minus 90, minus 95. Okay, so if a client device hears something and it's minus 89, okay, or minus 88, it's going to back off. It's going to back off and say the channel isn't clear because it can't transmit simultaneously. They've got to kind of interact with the medium, which is the frequency in the air, one at a time. And then there's an additional layer of protection, and I call it the any other energy detection. And the any other energy detection, I mean, it doesn't have to be 802.11, but we're talking 20 dB above the signal detect. So 24 dB. So if your noise floor is at minus 95, we're talking that if the client can hear anything at minus 75, it's going to back off. It's going to back off and it's going to wait its turn. And when you have tons and tons of clients and you've got tons and tons of activity in an area and they're all competing and contending for that resource, that channel, and they're backing off, everybody's going to get a turn because the protocol does a nice job of making sure that everybody gets a turn. But it's going to be a slower, a spottier, a sketchy experience that kind of feels like it's slow, it's fast, it's slow, it's fast. And that's really important for people to understand. A lot of people, Jim, they don't think about how sensitive it is, but it really is sensitive. And that's why it's like, even though these aren't your access points that are causing the problem, any noise in the environment could be, and therefore could be the source of congestion.
That's right. And with the shared medium, the channel that all the clients and APs are operating on, that's why it's so important to spread our APs out on different channels, non-overlapping channels, and only reuse channels when APs are far enough away that they're not going to trip the clear channel assessment of those other APs on the same channel.
That's right. That's right. They've got to be way into the minus 70s in order to not trip it. Minus 78, 79, something like that. Okay, so now let's talk about channels. Again, 2.4 we call a band. It's a swath of spectrum that's available. And what we've done is we've divvied it up. We've divided it up into these things we call channels. And I like to think of these channels as like lanes on the highway. Okay, so everybody's driving in their lanes and everybody stays in their lanes. And as long as everybody does that, everybody should be able to go fast, right? And in Wi-Fi, the width of the lane, okay, what we say at a minimum is 20 megahertz wide, because a 20 megahertz wide channel, just like how the lane on the road needs to be a certain width to accommodate your car, the width of the channel in Wi-Fi needs to be a certain amount to just accommodate the kind of the basic speeds or data rates that we want to be able to go in Wi-Fi. Okay, now you can, you obviously use less than 20 megahertz. You can use a slice of that, but it's not really going to give you the performance you're looking for. Okay, so you can see down here below, 2.412, 2.437. Those are the precise frequencies. Okay, it's the center that makes it the center. Now, with regards to 2.4, it's really just a 3-lane highway, guys. And those 3 lanes, they fill up fast. So it's not a lot of capacity. It's not a lot of spectrum that the government afforded us here. And not only that, but you've got to be careful with your overlapping, like Jim was talking about a moment ago. Everybody needs to stay on their lane, in their lane. If you have overlapping, it's kind of like a car swerving in and out of lanes on the highway. And when they do that, what happens? You run the risk of a collision. In Wi-Fi, there will be a collision. Those frames will collide in midair. Remember, if I'm on channel 1 and you're on channel 2, we're not subject to the clear channel assessment because we can't hear each other. We're on different frequencies. And if I can't hear you and you can't hear me, then we're not going to take turns properly. And we're going to broadcast or transmit simultaneously. That's going to be a collision. All right. And then if that keeps happening over and over and over again in an environment, then the Wi-Fi experience is just going to get slower and slower and slower as the protocol tries to negotiate its way through all of this mess. Okay. So we've got to stay in our lanes. Now, because these lanes fill up so fast in 2.4, okay, and it kind of looks like this in 2.4. And again, because of the clear channel assessment, and because we've got to kind of interact with the radio and the access point one at a time, we've got bumper to bumper traffic. Just like how we wish that we could leapfrog over a slow car in Wi-Fi, we can't do it. We got to wait for the person in front of us to steer and turn off the road before we can go fast again. Right? Now, a lot of people will say, well, what about MU-MIMO, Eric? You know, what about multi-user? Multiple in, multiple out. Why can't we use that in order to gain more efficiency or more traction? And Jim, I was talking to you about this the other day that, you know, it's on paper, looks great, but in practice, not quite delivering. And I was hoping that you can explain that a little bit to our audience.
Well, it's the physics of actually making multi-user MIMO, where those different multipath streams, if you will, could be directed at multiple clients instead of just one. It turns out that's really difficult to implement and get to work. Right. Even inside labs, you can get it to work in specific circumstances, but out in the real world, it's usually something that we just turn off, so we don't even have to worry about some of the things it results in terms of overhead on the channel and things like that. But for the most part, it doesn't work.
Therefore, for all intents and purposes, clients are interacting with the radio one at a time. And that's why at 7Signal, sometimes we're big fans, if possible, to not throttle guest networks. If you've got an access point that's in a conference area and it's broadcasting a corporate SSID and a guest SSID, both on channel 36, for example, and your guests come in and we've decided that we want to throttle our guests to only be able to go 3 megabits per second. Whereas if you're on the corporate network, you can go 100 megabits per second. You don't know what a guest is going to do when they come into your environment. So there's the possibility that when they come into your environment and get onto your guest network in the conference room, they're going to start downloading a 1 gigabyte movie. And that's going to basically consume a lot of channel resources. Everybody in the room is like, hey, what just happened to the Wi-Fi? And it could be that we're waiting for this guest over here to finish what they're doing before we can all go fast again. Remember, there's only one channel 36, okay? And it's in the air, it's a frequency, and it's shared by guests and by corporate people alike, okay? So if you don't have to worry about bandwidth restrictions, our advice is just let people go as fast as they can. Get them on, get them off, get them on, get them off, all right? And the faster you can clear the channel, the better it is for everyone. You know what I mean, Jim?
Yeah, absolutely. Get on and off as fast as possible and free up the channel for other users.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, guys. So now, because 2.4, for all intents and purposes, is a 3-lane highway, we use band steering technology to try to get people over to the 5 gigahertz band. And we also make those adjustments in our controller. Like we said earlier, if we can decrease the power of 2.4, then when clients come along, they'll hear 5 gigahertz first, and they'll hopefully latch onto it. We can't tell a client what to do. Okay, it's going to determine what it wants to do based upon its adapter, its software drivers, right? And so what we want it to do is latch on to 5 gigahertz where it has a better chance at a good end user experience. Why? Because there are many more channels. It's like a 25-lane highway, depending upon where you are in the world. Okay, and that means that everybody should be able to spread out and go fast. All right. Band steering technology is not complicated. It's really just kind of like a speeding up of the of the 5 gigahertz beacon, maybe slowing down the advertising of 2.4, again, in an attempt to influence a client coming along to latch on to 5 gigahertz first and only use 2.4 if it can't hear anything else as a last resort. Okay. Now let's look here at these channels. Okay, now not all of these are unlicensed. I mean, they're all unlicensed, but there's this section in the middle here that we call the DFS channels, and they are shared with other things that take priority over Wi-Fi. Things like weather radar is the #1 thing, like Doppler weather radar. And what that means is that depending upon whether or not you live near a harbor or an airport or something like that, you might not be able to use all of these channels in the middle reliably. Okay, you may be able to only reliably use these, the Uni 1, the Uni 3, and then there's this little 165 out here, which is kind of a secret weapon sometimes that a lot of people forget about, especially in dense environments. But here's the thing. If you're in a dense environment, you have to try to use these channels. Okay, some devices don't support these channels. Some routers, like home routers, don't support these channels. Okay, so depending upon the situation, you've got to try. Jim, you were in a situation where it's like you walked in the door and like they weren't using DFS at all, and you took on a big project to try to figure out what devices would use it. Let's figure out if we can use it. And when we did use it, it completely altered the performance of the network, right?
Yeah, that's right. Because in 5 gigahertz, 2/3 of the band, or stated another way, 2/3 of the capacity the band can provide is tied up in those DFS channels. So yeah, if you carefully survey the clients that you have to support and make sure you're going to only use channels that they'll support, then in most networks today, it's worth turning them on and
Trying it out.
Even if you do get a few radar detects here and there, think about the impact. If it's every couple days, it's not the end of the world.
That's right.
So
yeah, it could make a big difference.
Yeah.
Now, there are some cool things that people do in 5 gigahertz that allow us to improve or increase performance. But if we're not careful and we don't do it properly, we can get in a lot of trouble. And I'm talking about channel bonding. We have the ability to take 2 channels, bond them together, and create something called HT40. Okay, 40 megahertz wide, high throughput, 40 megahertz wide channel. And when I do this, I literally double the ability to go fast. Literally double the ability to go fast. Now over here, you can see where I've taken 4 channels and I've created VHT80, very high throughput, 80 megahertz wide channel. I am literally quadrupling the ability to go fast. And you say, wow, why wouldn't everybody do that? That sounds amazing, right? Well, there's a couple of reasons why. First, you may not be paying your ISP to go that fast. So what's the point, right? It's like, rain on your parade. It's very expensive. Second, you may not have a client device that's capable of going that fast. So what's the point? And third, and this is the most important reason in my opinion, when you might have a hot rod that can go really, really fast, and it could take advantage of the 80 megahertz wide channel, that's great. But if you do channel bonding up and down the spectrum, then you now cut down on the overall number of non-overlapping channels. And if you're not careful, you're going to end up right back where you started with a whole bunch of congestion. Okay. So this is something you really got to be wary of. On a 20 megahertz wide channel, okay, on I think it's 256 QAM, it's 144.4 data rate. And if it's 1024 QAM, it's a 173.3 data rate if I've got that correct. That should be plenty in most situations, not all, but most situations. That means I usually cut the number in half. And so I should be able to go 50, 60, 70 megabits per second of throughput. And in most situations, that should be enough. And therefore, you need to consider whether it's worth it to do channel bonding. You would never do 80 megahertz wide channels in an enterprise. And then depending upon your research, you would consider doing 40 megahertz wide in an enterprise again, if you feel like it's necessary and you don't have a lot of other neighbors around you who potentially would be overlapping and interfering with you. Jim, any words on channel bonding in the enterprise?
Yeah, and 5 gigahertz, your choices are really 20 megahertz or 40 megahertz. And I tend to default to 20 megahertz unless there's a use case for going higher.
Yep.
It's not, it's not the end of the world if we're not using up all the available spectrum. That means there's spectrum open for other users that come and go, and maybe they'll come and show up on channels you're not using. So that's
That's what
okay
you
with
want.
me. Yeah.
That's what you want. Exactly. Agree. Yeah. Play nicely. Share.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So here we go. Let's review this. So 2.4, 3-lane highway, 5 gigahertz, depending upon where you live, 25-lane highway. And now, holy moly, Jim. I mean, the FCC last year here in the United States said we're going to open up a whole new highway, a whole new highway. The 6 gigahertz band of spectrum, Wi-Fi 6E for extended. Basically, here in the United States, a 59-lane highway. Now, in other parts of the world, they're not opening up all 59 lanes. It's more like 25 lanes, I believe. But nevertheless, it is a big, big deal that they decided to do this because Wi-Fi isn't going anywhere. It is getting more and more popular, more and more mission critical, and so we need more capacity. And this was really exciting when this came out.
Yeah, it's huge. It's finally, we've had the availability of 80 megahertz channel widths since 802.11 AC in 2013, 10 years ago. And with this big expansion in spectrum, now we can actually use them in the 6 gigahertz band, in for Wi-Fi. So maybe
Very
even
exciting.
160 megahertz in some cases.
Now, 6 gigahertz is a higher frequency than 5 gigahertz. So remember what we talked about at the top of the hour with regards to signal propagation? It's not going to propagate quite as far. And so that's, Jim, I think it's still kind of unknown as to what to expect. Would you agree, or do we know?
Yeah, it's early days. I think the rough estimate is think 2 to 5 dB below 5 gigahertz.
Okay. 2 to
6
5.
gigahertz is so wide that you actually have to consider the wavelength difference of the low end of the band versus the high end of the band. The higher end of the band, which actually goes above 7 gigahertz, will have reduced propagation compared to the lower end. And there are also special transmit power rules about 6 gigahertz. But one of the things that really seems to make a difference today is if the client has an antenna system that was really tuned well for 6 gigahertz. So it seems like some clients are reusing 5 gigahertz antenna designs, and those don't perform as well for 6 gigahertz reception. So
Interesting.
something to test.
Yeah. And a lot of people are interested in, with 6 gigahertz, I want to use more 80 megahertz wide channels, 160 megahertz wide channels. And you just have to be careful. I mean, you do, naturally kind of raise when you widen the channel, you're naturally kind of letting in more noise and you're raising the noise floor a little bit. So just be mindful of that as well with regards to energy detect and all of that. All right, next topic, guys, interference. Okay, so what is interference? Well, just like when you're at work and it's really hard to get work done because everybody's yelling and screaming all around you, it's the same thing in Wi-Fi. It is really hard for Wi-Fi networks to get work done when it is really noisy all around them. This poor guy on the screen is like, oh my gosh, help me. Okay, so let's talk about that. So what is noise? Okay, it's all around us, and basically it'll impede what we're trying to accomplish here. We can't see it, we can't hear it, but in fact, these signals are all around us. And so there could be people on the same frequency that we're using. There could be people on adjacent frequencies. They're all around us. And so it's really hard to figure out, what is going on all around us without certain systems and tools and such like that. But they could be impeding our ability. Here's another example. You go into a cafe and you want to have a conversation with your friend over a cup of coffee, and you can't. And the reason why is because there's people all around you. You got the little musicians and you got people blasting their music and they've got music overhead. And so what do? There's only two things that you can do in interference in Wi-Fi, guys. Two things. And this is my opinion, of course. One is you can knock on somebody's door and say, hey, can you keep it down? Can you turn it down? But realistically, guys, you really can't do that because it's unlicensed spectrum and they're just entitled to use it as you are. So the other thing, guys, that you can do is you identify where it is so that you can avoid it. So that you can avoid it. And that, and then I'll go to the library, go someplace quiet. All right. And that's really an important part. Some people say, okay, you know what? If it's really loud and noisy in a certain area, why don't I turn up the volume? Why don't I boost the transmit power? Why don't I increase the signal to overcome the noise in an environment, right? You guys know that. That's what signal to noise ratio means. All right. We need to shout over top of everybody in order to be heard. So yes, that is certainly possible. You can certainly do that. But you got to be mindful of the fact that now you become the nuisance. And not only that, you're the noisy neighbor. And also, if adjacent radios have automation built into them, there's a good chance that they might turn up their power as well. And then you're right back where you started. So again, that strategy of identifying where it's noisy so that you can avoid it is usually the best way to go. Okay. The other thing you got to be careful of is if you just turn up the volume everywhere, now you're going to have too much Wi-Fi. And too much Wi-Fi can be worse than not enough Wi-Fi. Again, all of these different signals overlapping, interfering. This one's on channel 36. This one's on channel 36. And so now, this, you could have a client device over in the corner here that's connecting to an access point on the other side of the suite inappropriately. And this can cause a lot of imbalance in your system, and it's not good. All right, we need to calm it down. We need to tone it down in order to get those cells the right size. And that's where we use tools and systems to help us. Okay, last topic, your devices. Remember, they make a lot of decisions. They play a big role in the Wi-Fi experience. So let's take a look at that. Inside your device, like a laptop, you got these tiny little adapter cards with tiny little antennas on them. Okay, and you need to know what those capabilities are. You need to know the capabilities. And, and then you even need to ignore certain things like, oh, wow, capable of 2.4 gigabits per second. That's just a theoretical speed. Okay, that's not realistic. Same thing down here. Hey, they're advertising MU-MIMO. We just talked about how that's not necessarily realistic in the enterprise. So just know what you're getting into. Do your research with regards to what the true capabilities and limitations are of these things. Okay. Now, the most important thing when it comes to devices that you need to know is that these devices, they have software, and the software drivers associated are the ones that are evaluating what's going on in the air and determining things like what networks to join, what frequencies or channels to use, where and when to roam. Now, here's the next problem. The next problem is that these Wi-Fi drivers, they're all proprietary. Intel makes them different from Qualcomm, makes them different from Realtek, and it goes on and on and on. And so different devices behave differently in different environments. It's very frustrating that we don't have more coordination of this in the marketplace, but we don't. Okay, and so Mac devices roam differently than Windows devices, and this makes it very difficult in order to design in the enterprise as a result. And we wish that there was something that we can do, but there's not, because there wasn't a standard for how device drivers should be written so that they conform to some kind of standard that everybody can use. Okay. So here's just a small optics example. All right, so you've got these people right here. These people, what is their device going to do? It hears 2.4 really loud. It hears 5 gigahertz really softly. You don't know. It's the device that's going to make the decision. Okay, so you just need to know that that's out there. Maybe it's going to, stick to the coffee shop across the street. You don't know. Okay, so here we go, guys. We came to the end of our session, and just, a couple of takeaways for you. First of all, is that you really need to know the capabilities and limitations of the bands. Okay, 2.4 is different from 5, is different from 6E. Okay, and you need to understand what you're up against with regards to those capabilities and limitations. We talked a little bit about propagation today and how some are more prone to get congested than others. We talked about the dangers of channel bonding and how that can cause interference if we're not careful. And then the second bullet, sharing is caring. Okay, so just like Jim was talking about earlier, use what you need to use, and don't be a spectrum hog and just make 80 megahertz wide channels all up and down the spectrum. Be nice. And then finally, we want to leave you with, it's not always the Wi-Fi network. Clients make decisions too. Okay, they're actually big decision makers. And so you've got to know what devices are capable of and where they might be falling down. So there you have it. There you have it, guys. Just some basic concepts for you today. Hopefully if you're new to Wi-Fi, you learned a thing or two about what you're up against. So Heather, I'm gonna kind of take it back to you and Jim to see if there's anything else that we can touch on, or if there are any quick questions.
Yeah, I think we're ready to get into some Q&A. Jim, if you want to.
Yeah, sounds good. Sounds good. And just on that last point about clients being big decision makers, sometimes the best thing you can do is not give them a decision to make, because they're often not making bad decisions. So one of the things that's come up in the chat a few times is, let's go 5 gigahertz only, right? If you can get away with it, if you have clients that all support 5 gigahertz, just disable 2.4 gigahertz entirely, or maybe just create an SSID that's 5 gigahertz only and put all those important clients there. I think if you can do that, that's a really good idea.
I love that. Don't give them the ability to choose.
Yep.
Take away their decision-making ability. It's good.
So a couple good questions came up in the Q&A, and first from IAM, who says, for coverage in a home environment, do you recommend more antenna gain to let devices benefit from coverage? If yes, does higher gain have an impact on propagation pattern? And the answer to that is yes. And then there's an example there. So I don't know. I don't really see people swapping antennas a lot with consumer APs, or they usually have integrated antennas these days. What do you think, Eric?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the best thing that I would recommend is figure out a way to get your home router in the middle of your house.
Yeah.
It's the best thing to do. Usually people have it tucked in the corner in the office upstairs. Maybe it's in a closet. Get that thing out in the open. Let it breathe. That's really, really important. Don't put it next to the refrigerator. I've seen that as well in the kitchen. Okay. Don't put it next to the fireplace. I've seen that as well. Make that the centerpiece of your home is my advice. I mean, mesh networks are very expensive, and extenders are weak and lame because they create a whole nother Wi-Fi network in your house. So I don't like that. And they also have a tendency, they will cut your bandwidth or your throughput in half. So figure out a way to get that thing in the middle of your home.
Yeah. And like Jonathan said, if you have a big palatial estate like Eric does, you need to add access points. That's the best thing to do. Add another AP somehow.
Totally agree.
Question from Forrest, and thanks for coming, Forrest. Seems like you're here every week. Love that. What about using Cisco's flexible radio assignment? The company seems mired in its implementation. Seems band steering through reducing 2.4 power should be all that's needed. Yeah, and so what FRA does is it's kind of an extension of RRM, where the controller will automatically switch a radio from 2.4 to 5 gigahertz to make an AP dual 5 gigahertz, or just disable that radio entirely if there's if there are too many 2.4 gigahertz radios providing coverage. So I think I don't like to give the network that level of control, and I don't think you need to be switching radios between bands
that much.
Just you do your design, and I don't see a real need to do that. I haven't seen a good use case for that. So I tend to agree. Turn 2.4 power down and disable a lot of 2.4 gigahertz radios. Maybe put them in monitor mode if you have better Cisco APs, so you can get something out of that radio. But
it's an algorithm made by man, therefore flawed. It doesn't always work the way you think it's going to work, right?
Yep. So Nick, with the question, are there any tools in 7-signal that would help someone decide if channel bonding would work in a particular environment that is currently being monitored? On the other side, can 7-signal identify places where channel bonding is causing issues and should be removed? What do you think, Eric?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, we can see the overlapping channels all over the place with our system. And not only that, but we can also see the retry rate to see how much of an impact it is. I mean, if you have overlapping channels, but you know, your neighbor over here or whatever that's doing the overlapping barely uses the Wi-Fi network, you know, they're hardly ever home or something, it's not a big deal. But if they're using their network and you're using your network a lot, there's going to be a lot of retries in the air. And we calculate that to see the severity in order to determine if, you know, steps are required, right?
Yeah, for sure. Interesting comment from Derek in the chat. He says lots of cable operators have 5 gigahertz prioritized over 2.4, or in some instances disable the radio on the gateway. I have not seen that, but that is really great news. Normally the CPE from the cable companies that I have observed is both radios full blast, widest channels possible, just creating a real disaster. So good to hear there's some progress there.
Absolutely. Gosh, you know, they're going to have to start giving consumers a little bit more control. You know, like you said, I mean, they don't allow any of the DFS channels on some of these home routers. It's just not appropriate.
I'm still here, but I'm having video issues. So we'll just power through it. Last question from Forrest. He wants to know if Wi-Fi is provided to attendees at the Super Bowl and what band does it use? It was provided. I don't know the specifics of the network. Most of these very high density, large public venue networks now are 5 gigahertz only.
Oh yeah.
And because this is an outdoor network, they weren't able to do 6 gigahertz this year, but maybe next year when all that's sorted out.
Yeah, and you'll see these panels in the when you're walking down the stairs connected to the banister or the arm rail, and those are directional antennas that are shooting down the rows of seats.
Yeah, Joe Clark said Extreme Networks has a webinar on it, so that might be a good reference to go check out.
Awesome. A lot of great questions and activity today. Really exciting.
Yeah.
So thanks guys for stepping up with your curiosity, and really appreciate it. And the great, you know, very active chat today as well. So love that.
Absolutely. All right. I think
take us home.
I think that.
All right. Taking this chariot home, guys. All right. Well, thanks to all of you for joining us. Thanks, Eric. Another wonderful session. Thanks, Jim, hiding in the darkness, for joining us and for your input. And thanks to all of you for being here. We will see you again, same time, same place next week. And have a great rest of your week and weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.